Okay, so today we're going to go into triangle congruence proofs, and we're just going to take notes on the first page here, and the second page we're going to save for Monday. So for triangle congruence proofs, we are told that the triangles are congruent, and we just need to prove that. So we're going to start with one that gives us all the statements, and then we're going to have to create statements on our own and reasons on our own. So let's start with number one. I think looking at an example will help us. So first we want to start with what's given. And whatever is given always goes in the first box of your statements. And then we want to mark what's given. So RJ is congruent to RK, and SJ is congruent to SK. So that's what we're given. And the reason for this is always just going to be given. So the first one, given. Now number two, RS is congruent to RS. So that just tells us, I forgot my double marks here, there we go. So we'll put 3 marks here, and that tells us that this is congruent to itself. Now the reason is called the reflexive property. So reflexive property. Because we're kind of just reflecting it on itself. So this line, if you reflect it, it's going to be in the same spot, it's itself. So we call that the reflexive property. And the last one is always going to be your congruence theorem. So that's like the side angle side or side side side, all of those that we learned about. That's always going to go in this last box. And so here we have side, side, side. So we just proved this one congruent. So let's look at number 2. This one, they don't give us all the statements, so we have to come up with one on our own. So again, the first one is always given, and now let's mark it. So K is the midpoint of CD, so right here, it's cutting this in half. You don't have to mark anything for that, I was just showing you. And then we know that AK is congruent to KB. So why is CK congruent to DK? So why are these congruent? The reason for this one is just that is the definition of midpoint. Because a midpoint is always going to cut something in half, and because they told us that K is the midpoint of CD, we know it's cutting it directly in half, and so that's our reason for that one. Now, we need something else to prove that this is congruent. We know it is, but we need something to prove it. So one thing that I see here that we can prove is that this angle is congruent to this angle because they're vertical. So on number 3 for the statement, we're just going to write what congruence we marked here. So we marked that angle CKB. Oops. So CKB is, it's a different color, here we go, is this one. And we said that that is congruent to AKD. And the reason for this one is just because vertical angles are congruent. And then finally, what rule did we use? Side, angle, side. Okay, let's look at number 3. So this one we have to come up with 2 statements on our own. So again, the first one is given. And we're going to go ahead and mark what they tell us. So we have that RJ is congruent to RK, and that RS bisects JK. So right here, it's bisecting this line, again, so it's cutting it in half. So this is kind of similar to the definition of a midpoint, right? Because the midpoint is in the middle. If something bisects it, it's also cutting it in half. So we can say that JS is congruent to SK because that is the definition of a bisector. Now, one thing I want to note here is that it doesn't say it's a perpendicular bisector, it just says it's a bisector. So we can't note any right angles because it doesn't tell us that it's perpendicular, it only tells us that it cuts it in half. If it was perpendicular, that would prove right angles, but it doesn't, so we can't have any right angles here. And then the next thing that we can note is that RS is congruent to RS. And so again, that is called our reflexive property. And this one, hold on, I forgot to mark these congruent. There we go. And this is because of side, side, side. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a few hints at the bottom before we go on to these ones where we have to make all of the statements and all of the reasons ourselves. So some hints is that the first one, that first box, is always going to be given. So it's always going to be what they give you, and the reason is given. And some things that you want to look for when you're trying to prove them congruent is the reflexive property. So is there anything that you can mark as congruent to itself? Remember that bisector and midpoint cuts in half. So you're going to have congruent sides here. And then perpendicular is going to form right angles. And you also want to look for vertical angles because those are going to be congruent. So those are a few things just to look out for as you're going through. One more thing you could write here at the top here. I'm not going to list all of our different types of angles, but when we have parallel lines, and a transversal, look for those corresponding angles, vertical angles, all of those different things. You'll have to remember those. I'm not going to list them all out here, but if you ever see parallel lines, try to see which other line could be the transversal to those parallel lines, and then what other kinds of angles can I mark. So those are a few things to look for. That's going to be important when we get on to number 4 because we have some parallel lines here. But that is all we are going to do for today. And then on Monday, we will finish up these notes.